In this video, we are going to look at our second method for solving quadratic equations, and that is by taking the square root. You are going to take your notes in your booklet on page 6. It is very important to note that this only works if you do not have an x term, so your b is 0. So in other words, it's an ax squared plus c equals 0, or some other combination of those terms, as you'll see in just a minute. So there is no x term. That is the only way that you can use this method. If you have an x term, this method doesn't work for us. Now, we're going to take a few steps, and they're pretty simple. We're going to isolate the x squared term using inverses, so addition and subtraction are inverses, multiplication and division are inverses. Then we're going to take the square root of both sides. That's because at that point we'll have x squared, and the opposite of squaring is square rooting. So that's why we'll take the square root of both sides. Inverses once again. Then plug in to check your answer. Now, there is one very, very, very important thing. You must use a plus or minus when you take the square root of both sides of an equation. The reason for this is that when you square something, whether it's positive or negative, your answer is negative. So whether it's positive or negative, your answer is positive. So I'm going to take a look up in the corner here at a very simple case. You can write this in the corner for you as well. If I just have x squared equals 4, and I take the square root of both sides, it looks like my answer is just x equals 2. And that is an answer, because if I do 2 squared, I get 4. But remember, with an x squared, I usually expect 2 solutions. So here's why the other solution is there. If I do negative 2 squared, I also get 4. So when I say you must use plus or minus, what I'm saying is when you take the square root, you have to consider the positive one and the negative one. So that's actually 2 answers, plus or minus 2. Very important there, because again, with the squared, you're going to expect 2 answers. Okay, we're going to do 1, 3, and 5 in the video, and then 2, 4, and 6 we're going to do in class together. So starting with number 1, first I want to isolate the x squared. I want to get this by itself. In order to do that, I need to divide by 2. Because it was being multiplied by 2, and that's the inverse. Now once I have the x squared by itself, I'm going to take the square root of both sides, giving me, don't forget the plus or minus, 2. If I go back to my original, that's my answers right there. If I go back to my originals and take out the x and plug in 2, I get 2 times 4 is 8, and that's a true statement. And if I plug in negative 2, I also get 2 times 4 equals 8, and that's a true statement. So whether I plug in 2 or negative 2, I get a true statement. That's why I need both solutions there. Okay, let's take a look at number 3. So on number 3, I am going to isolate the x squared. So again, what that means is I'm going to get this by itself. So just like when I'm solving a linear, I'm going to start on the same side but furthest away. So I'm going to add 15 to both sides. And then divide by 3. Now that I have the x squared by itself, I can take my square root. And this one's a little tricky because 5 is not a perfect square. So 4 was a perfect square. When I take the square root of 4, I get 2. 5 is not a perfect square. There's not an integer that multiplied by itself gives me 5. I could use my calculator to approximate, or I can write my exact answer, x equals plus or minus the square root of 5. We'll talk about how to plug in to check that one later. Don't forget the plus or minus. And again, I'm leaving it as the square root of 5 because 5 is not a perfect square. If I punch it into my calculator, I can approximate. All right, taking a look at number 5. Notice number 5 is a little different because I don't have x squared, I have x minus 2 squared. But you see how this entire side, this entire left-hand side, is being squared? That means I'm ready to take my square root. So here we go. Let's come in here and take our square root of both sides. Don't forget the plus or minus. And still, guys, the square root and the square undo each other. So that's going to give me x minus 2. And on this side, I'm going to do plus or minus. 36 is a perfect square, so plus or minus 6. And then I need to add 2 to both sides. So I get x equals, I'm going to put the 2 in front. 2 plus or minus 6. Then I'm going to do those two problems. 2 plus 6 is 8. 2 minus 6 is negative 4. So again, the x is coming from doing 2 plus 6, and the negative 4 is coming from doing 2 minus 6. Again, we'll plug in and check it together tomorrow.